Hello, my name is Louise, but everyone calls me Lou. From the outside, it probably looks like I have the most glamorous life. I come from a rich family. I go to a prominent private college in New York, and I live in a mansion called Plutus Heights with my group of friends. Sounds pretty epic, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to live with a bunch of rich kids? Well, just wait. So many unexpected things were about to happen to me, including my current dreamy boyfriend, and it all started the day I moved into Plutus Heights. Before I dive into all the crazy stuff that happened to me, let me tell you a bit more about myself. My parents run a super successful restaurant chain. From fast food joints to fine dining, they cover it all. Because of this, I've always been interested in the food industry, so that's why I chose to study economics and food industry management. However, there was just one small problem. I was still living at home with my parents, and I have a 5-year-old little brother, so it was pretty distracting. All my friends were living in their own fancy loft apartments, and I wanted that independent life too. Well, lucky for me, it was just around the corner. One day, my dad invited a business friend he'd met earlier that year over for dinner. He was big in the tech world, and my dad loved these kinds of networking dinners. This guy brought his family, and that's when I met Aaliyah. She was the same age as me, and we had so much in common. In fact, she even studied at the same college as me. The best part was that when my dad mentioned that he was looking for a place for me to start living independently, Aaliyah suddenly said, "Lou, oh my God, you should totally move into the mansion I live in." This was what I wanted. I was so scared my parents would say no, but actually, they were totally on board. I think they realized it was time I had my own space. Finally, the day came to move into Plutus Heights. I couldn't believe it when we pulled up outside it. It looked like a palace. Honestly, it was like something out of a European fairy tale. There were pillars and even 2 white lions by the front door. It was crazy. I seriously expected a butler to appear. Aaliyah was waiting by the door for me and gave me the grand tour. I think my jaw almost hit the marble floor. Who would have thought that this mansion was for students to live? The entire interior of this mansion was very luxurious and splendid, but the more she showed me, the more I started to feel uncomfortable. These fancy things just didn't fit me. I wasn't into showing off at all, but it seemed like this palace was built for that reason. But what could I do? I was already there, so I guess I just have to get used to it. As Aaliyah showed me around, she told me about the other students who lived there. Jeremy, Will, and Mark were the 3 guys who owned the place. Well, their parents owned it, but technically it was theirs now. They were all best friends, and Jeremy's girlfriend Naomi also lived there. But Naomi had been uncomfortable with being the only girl, so she'd asked Aaliyah to move in too. Aaliyah's family weren't exactly over the moon about her living with 3 boys and a couple, so they felt much better now knowing that I was going to be living there too. Weirdly enough, my parents were fine about the fact I'd be living with 3 boys. And after a few days living here, I realized that it was totally fine too, because I barely had any contact with the others. It was only after a few months when they threw a welcome party for a newbie called David that I really got to know them. David was Mark's cousin and had just enrolled at our college, majoring in business management. Aaliyah told me that David was quite an extravagant person and came from a seriously rich family. So he thought the first must-do thing was throwing a welcome party for him. I almost laughed. He must be very famous, or really desired to be famous. But to be honest, I'd have hated flashy parties anyway. The party was held on the lawn of the mansion, and Aaliyah had warned me to dress accordingly. And when Aaliyah saw me wearing jeans and a blouse, she immediately dragged me to her room and lent me the most flashy dress I've ever seen. I felt so ridiculous in it. Yes, I was born into the US elite, but it just wasn't my style to wear fancy clothes and show off like this. As soon as we went down to the party, Jeremy, Will, and Mark were already surrounded by a group of girls. Typical, right? What else do you expect from rich, handsome guys? Jeremy is African American and is pretty much John Legend's twin. He barely turned up to class and instead spent most of his time out singing. Actually, he was already pretty famous, and Aaliyah told me he was worth millions already. He was a total babe magnet, and all the girls were swarming around him. Honestly, he was such an attention seeker. I basically rolled my eyes when I saw him. Then there was Mark. At first, I'd been excited to meet him because his family ran an investment company and he was the head of the college's investment club, where he taught people how to invest their money, family money, wink wink, to make smart investment decisions. I immediately joined the club, but I quickly regretted it. Mark was so strict. He made us investigate various companies' financial situations and report back to him. Then, if we got something wrong, he'd call us out in front of everyone. It was humiliating. Loads of people dropped out of the club, and I almost did too. Okay, and I can't forget Will. He was studying engineering, and he always said good morning to me and smiled at me. Seemed to be the most gentle guy here. Out of the 3 guys, he was the only one who really greeted me. And yet, that's as far as it went. For some reason, he kept his distance. He smiled, but it felt cold somehow. I figured it was because he basically came from a royal family, and that kindly expression was just glued to their face. You know, to dangerously hide something inside them. Anytime I approached him, he would just smile, then walk away. And it wasn't just me. He showed no interest in any of the girls at the party either. But anyway, that's enough about the boys. The party was now in full swing, and I was standing there all by myself, feeling awkward. I had to find someone to talk to, but Aaliyah was too busy with her friends. Just at that moment, Naomi arrived in the most ridiculous haute couture dress. Oh, I haven't told you about Naomi yet. Okay, so she is basically a celeb. Her whole family are celebs, and she's been a model since she was 15. Unlike her boyfriend Jeremy, she was quite hard to approach. She was really sassy and didn't have much time for anyone, unless they were a celeb too. As soon as Jeremy saw Naomi, he pushed all the other girls away and headed towards her for a kiss. The party was already driving me crazy, and it had just started. I was about to go back to my room when I spotted David sitting alone under a tree on the lawn. I plucked up the courage to go chat to him and asked if he was okay. He said,
"What do you think? This is meant to be my party. But just look around. I might as well be invisible."
Then he told me that since college, everything had gone downhill. He was no longer the popular guy he'd once been. I was about to sit down next to him and comfort him when all of a sudden, something smashed. I quickly turned around, and there were 2 girls standing there with shards of a porcelain statue around their feet. The whole party had gone silent, and everyone was just staring in shock. One of the girls came right up to David and yelled out, "You think it's okay to just dump my friend by text and then move right on to the next girl?" David just grinned and said,
"She just couldn't satisfy me anymore."
Then the friend of his ex shouted, "Oh boy, you couldn't afford her. What are you expecting?" At that, David went bright red and shouted, "There's nothing I can't afford." I guessed that the girl's comment hurt David's pride because he looked so hurt and angry and started rushing towards her, so I quickly jumped in between them to hold him back. Suddenly, David grabbed my hand and said,
"At least I'm with a more mature girl now. Someone who actually deserves me."
I was so embarrassed. Everyone was watching, and I hated being in the spotlight like this. I didn't know what else to do, so I just played along and kept on holding his hand. The girls both looked so shocked and started walking away, but David quickly called out to them,
"Oh, by the way, girls, that statue you just smashed, it cost $2 million. You can split the bill. Thanks."
They both just froze and watched as David kissed me on the cheek and pulled me away. I could feel their eyes piercing into my back, and I swear I was shaking. I was so nervous. Also, I might have been kind of nervous because this gorgeous boy was holding my hand and not letting go. For the rest of the party, he kept introducing me to everyone as his girlfriend, getting me drinks from the bar, and always making sure I was okay. No one had ever been so sweet to me before, and before the party was up, I thought to myself that David was actually a pretty cool guy, not at all how I'd expected him to be. Little did I know that the next day, I'd discover another side to him. I woke up to David knocking on my door. As soon as I saw him, my heart started beating faster. "Do you want to come in?" I asked him. Then he just winked and said,
"Duh, Lou. I couldn't wait to see you again. In fact, would you be interested in going on a date with me? I wanted to thank you for the night."
I could feel my face going bright red. Then I looked at him and said, Sure. Why not? Well, let's just say the date wasn't what I had in mind. First, he took me to the mall. I was so confused. Then I realized he must have been embarrassed by my simple clothes. He said he wanted to treat me to some expensive clothes, which annoyed me. That wasn't my style at all. Why was he trying to change me? Then he took me to a club to meet all his friends, and he kept ordering the most expensive bottles of wine. He was just showing off, and I hated it. Then it got worse when a group of beautiful girls arrived. As soon as he saw them, he left me sitting there all alone and started flirting with them. Aaliyah was right. He was nothing but a playboy, and I'd had enough. So much for a date. I told David I wanted to go home, and he got angry. He said I was a spoilsport, and then laughed, saying I didn't know how to have fun. I was furious, so I said to him, "Why did you even invite me on this date? Just so you could show off and pretend you had a girlfriend?" I didn't even wait for him to reply. I just left and took a taxi home. I could barely sleep that night. I felt so annoyed at myself for almost falling for such an idiot. Then the next morning, things got even worse. I went downstairs and found Mark, Will, and Jeremy talking about David. They said he'd been arrested and put in a jail cell. Apparently, he'd been driving drunk, and when the police stopped him and fined him, he got mad and resisted them. So now he was in jail. Mark just laughed and said it was David's problem and that his parents would bail him out. Even though I was angry at the way David had treated me, I still felt sorry for him. I couldn't believe Mark would be so heartless. David is his cousin after all. I asked him which police station David was at, and then I stormed off to go find him. When I arrived at the station, David looked so happy to see me. He was exhausted and said,
"Oh, Lou, I'm so sorry about last night. I was such an ass. Please forgive me."
I still felt kinda mad at him, but I said, "I forgive you. Come on, let's get you home." He kept thanking me, saying how I was the only one who cared enough about him to come bail him out. He said,
"When I throw a party, all my friends come. When I open expensive wine, all the girls want to be my friend. But when I land up in jail, you're the only one sweet enough to come help me."
I told him that was how friends were supposed to act, and he kept smiling at me. And then something crazy happened. Right outside the police station, David turned to me and said,
"Listen, Lou, I like you. I know I just pretended you were my girlfriend, but I couldn't stop thinking about you in the cell last night. I was wondering, will you be my girlfriend? For real?"
I was shocked. I hadn't expected this at all. I mean, what was I supposed to say? I was speechless. If you want to know how I responded, stay tuned for the next episode. Which of my housemates will I end up spending the rest of my life with? Only time will tell. Hi, it's me, Lou again. In episode 1, I moved into Plutus Heights, and everything was going well until David showed up and rocked the boat. He told everyone I was his girlfriend, and at first, I was weirded out. But then I started to think maybe he was actually a pretty cool guy. Well, then he went and ruined that by asking me out on a date only to show me off, which resulted in him going to jail for drunk driving. As I bailed him out, he asked me if I wanted to be his girlfriend for real. To be honest, when he told me that he liked me, I was pretty moved. His deep voice and sincere look really touched my heart. But then reality hit me. David was still too young and ebullient. He probably just wanted me to be his girlfriend due to his contemporary feeling. So I held my breath for a second and replied to him, "David, I'm sorry, but I don't think I could be your girlfriend now. I think we'd better have more time to get to know each other." He seemed disappointed, but managed to give me a hug and said,
"Yes, as long as you want."
After that, we went home. And as we got home, no one even asked if we were fine and what just happened to us. Instead, Mark just blurted out,
"David, you loser. You need to rely on girls to help you? Come on, bro. Sort yourself out."
Then he smirked at me. Ugh, what was wrong with Mark? David was his cousin. How could he be so heartless? This was too much. It made me so angry. I honestly couldn't hold back my feelings. So I said to Mark, "Hey, if you don't have anything nice to say, then just keep your mouth shut, Mark." Seriously, I couldn't stand Mark one bit. Out of all the guys living in our home, Mark was the worst. He was just so rude. And from how he treated us at the investment club, it was clear he didn't respect anyone. One time, the club had a meeting to discuss an investment plan for a fancy restaurant for rich people in Las Vegas. And seeing as my family were in the restaurant industry, I plucked up the courage to share my ideas. But Mark shot down every single idea, and even had the cheek to tell me that my ideas were stupid and too risky. It took all my strength not to storm out of there. He was horrible. Had it not been for my enthusiasm, I would have withdrawn from the club, since I couldn't stand Mark's unpleasant personality. Talk about the project. After 2 months of non-stop researching, it came to my most exciting part. We were about to fly to Vegas to check out the market. Our group had 4 members, and we gathered to board the plane. When we boarded the plane, Mark deliberately pushed past me so he could get to his seat first. Such a man! Was he still pissed off when I told him to shut up? The trip went quite successfully. We had gathered a lot of useful information for our investment plan. After working hard on our project, in our last night in Las Vegas before flying back to New York, we went to the casino to blow off some steam. I had never seen anything like it in my life. There were people everywhere betting thousands of dollars. It looked fun, but I had no idea how to play. So I just watched the gamblers and took it all in. As I was wandering around, I felt someone grab my hand. It was Mark. He was sitting playing a game of poker, and it looked intense. I tried to walk away from him, but he said,
"Come on, give it a try."
And so I agreed and sat down next to him. He taught me the basic rules, and to my complete surprise, I was hooked. I got so into it, and by the 3rd round, I was really playing well. Call it beginner's luck, but there was no denying that Mark and I made a good team. He actually called me his lucky goddess at one point. Every time we won, he gave me a high five, and at one point, he even gave me a massive hug. I guess he just got so caught up in the excitement of winning, but it felt good to be hugged by someone so handsome. Don't get me wrong, it's just a cheering hug between friends, isn't it? We played for hours, and then eventually we got over it and went to the bar to get some drinks and celebrate how much money we'd won. By then, it was super late, and I was exhausted, so Mark walked me back to my room and said goodnight. As I flopped onto my bed, I thought to myself, maybe Mark isn't as bad as I thought he was. And then I drifted off into a drunken sleep where I thought about how fun we were that night and how handsome Mark was. The next morning, when I woke up, I had the worst headache. Clearly, I drank too much. I looked at the clock and freaked out. I'd definitely missed my flight. I grabbed my phone and was about to call Mark when I noticed I already had 2 missed calls from him. And then there was a text saying, "You little sleepyhead, guess I'll see you back in New York then?" I couldn't believe he'd left me here in Vegas all on my own. There was me thinking he was actually quite a nice guy, and now he'd gone and done this? Not cool at all. Well, I guess I'd spend another day or so in Vegas. Could be worse, right? I lay in bed for a while trying to get over my hangover, and then I went onto Facebook. I couldn't believe it. Jeremy had posted a status checking in to Las Vegas. I messaged him right away asking what he was doing here, and then he said he was putting on a show at a theater in the city. He invited me to join, and I agreed because it's not like I had other plans. That night, Jeremy sent someone to pick me up and take me to the theater. When I arrived, he was waiting outside to welcome me, and we chatted a bit. I told Jeremy that Mark had left me here all alone, and he just started laughing. He said,
"What a strange guy. How could he leave a girl as beautiful as you all alone in Vegas? Don't worry, I'll take good care of you, okay?"
Then he started stroking my hair, like I was his little sister or something. I was kind of surprised by how gentle and sweet he was being. I'd never really spent any time with Jeremy. I must have blushed, because the next moment, Jeremy was winking at me. And then he said he had to go backstage and get ready for the show. I'm not gonna lie, I assumed that Jeremy was only popular because he was good at promoting himself on social media. But when I watched him singing up there on stage like that, I was gobsmacked. He was incredible. Now I understood why all the girls swooned around him. Not only was he a babe, he was so flipping talented too. After the show, I waited outside for Jeremy, and then he said I could fly back to New York with him in his private jet, and that his driver would take me to the hotel to get my bags. Wow, what a nice guy. We basically talked the whole flight. Chatting to Jeremy was so easy, and it was so comfortable. For someone so famous, he was pretty down to earth. I really enjoyed his company. Turns out, being left alone isn't too bad. I got to know Jeremy more and have an enjoyable experience. We arrived home early the next morning, and we were both so tired, I went straight to bed and slept until after lunch. When I woke up, I played on my phone for a bit, scrolling through social media. That's when I saw it. An article had gone viral that Jeremy was having an affair with me. There were photos of us at the theater and even a photo of him stroking my hair. I started to panic. This was all just some crazy misunderstanding. How had I got caught up in the world of showbiz and gossip? I panicked and didn't know what to do next. While I was puzzled and worriedly scrolling down the pictures, suddenly my door burst open and Naomi barged into my room. Hi, it's me, Lou. I'm back again to share the next part of my story with you. Firstly, here's a quick recap. So, in the last episode, I started to think maybe Mark wasn't so bad after a crazy night playing poker with him in Vegas. But then I slept in and missed my flight back to New York, and that strict guy left without me. All alone in Vegas, I had a chance to spend time with Jeremy, the singer. He sent someone to take me to his show, then we could fly back to New York in his private jet. I thought it was just a lift. But then, horror of horrors, an article came out saying that Jeremy was having an affair with me. Jeremy's girlfriend Naomi burst into my room, and you won't believe what happened next. She started screaming at me, saying, "Lou, how dare you? You're a total skank, running around having an affair with my boyfriend." I opened my mouth to tell her it was all a big misunderstanding, but she kept shouting at me, saying I was nothing but a fake, who pretended to be all sweet and innocent, but underneath I was a total man-eater. Her words hurt me so much, and I tried to explain, but she just kept screaming at me. "If I see you go anywhere near Jeremy again, you won't know what's hit you. Stay away from my man." I was almost in tears by this point, and I said, "Naomi, please, I didn't do anything. The paparazzi got it all wrong. We didn't even hang out." But Naomi wouldn't hear it. As she walked out of my room, I said, "I really didn't do anything, and you should confront your boyfriend about the article before rudely humiliating me like that." She shouted one last thing. "You just wait," then slammed my door as she left, and I heard her kicking the wall outside in rage. I knew that she wouldn't leave me alone, but all I could do was just try my best to avoid troubles as much. Maybe I should have just moved home? Ever since I'd moved into Plutus Heights, it had been non-stop drama, and it just got worse. Every time Naomi saw me in our shared space, she'd storm away like I was a disease or something. One time I walked into the kitchen, she grimaced at my face and said, "Ew," and walked out. It was so awkward, but no one else seemed to notice or even care. They were probably used to Naomi acting like this. I got tired of it though, and avoided her as much as I could. That was until our investment club teamed up with her fashion club to work together on a fundraising project. We were putting on a fashion show to get investment for a fashion business project, and I was the host of the show, while Naomi was managing the modeling team and arranging everything that happened backstage. We rehearsed at our college, and Naomi always went out of her way to put down my ideas, and even got the models to do things wrong just to humiliate me. For example, I would announce designer A's outfit coming down the catwalk as a stylish fishtail dress, and she'd get the model who was wearing designer B's fluffy dress to walk out instead. Then on stage, I'd have to quickly fix what I'd said. It was so childish of her and made me look so unprofessional. The fashion show was going to be held at an epic beach resort with the catwalk leading down to the ocean. And as the models walked up and down, the sun would be setting right behind them. It was going to be amazing, as long as Naomi didn't ruin it for me. I heard the resort belonged to Will's family. Even though they had no interest in fashion, they'd agreed to sponsor the event as a way to promote their luxury car brand, so Will was there to help us. When the day rolled around, Mark was there as the investment representative. Jeremy was invited to perform, and of course, David was there for the hot models. So all the guys in our mansion were present at the event. Even though none of them were really there to specifically support me, I felt less nervous seeing some familiar faces. It was getting close to showtime, and I was working with the stage lighting team when suddenly someone bumped into me. I couldn't believe it. It was Naomi, and her glass of red wine went all over my brand new white dress. She pretended it had been an accident, but I knew exactly what she was up to. I wanted to scream, but luckily, I had a spare outfit in my bungalow, so I ran back there to change quickly. While I was changing, I heard someone outside my door. I hurried over to check who it was and was disgusted to see Naomi rushing away. I tried to open the door to ask what she was doing, and that's when I realized what she'd done. She'd locked me in! I managed to look out the window and see a huge metal padlock and chain on the door. I was stuck, and it was all Naomi's fault. How could she do this to me? I ran to get my phone to call for help, but I couldn't find it anywhere. I must have left it with the scripts near the stage, trying to run back as fast as I could. And when I tried to use the landline, the line was dead. Someone had cut it. Naomi was trying to ruin my life. My bungalow was far away from the main part of the resort, so no matter how loud I screamed, no one would hear me. I watched as the sun went down and knew it was time for the show to start. All the effort I'd put in over the past few weeks was for nothing. Everyone would be so angry at me. They'd been working nonstop for weeks, and I'd ruined everything. This was exactly what Naomi wanted. I ran around my room trying to find another way out, but even the windows were locked. It was hopeless. Time counted and kept counting, but there was nothing I could do. I threw myself onto my bed and cried myself to sleep. I don't know how long I drifted off for, but the next moment I heard someone roaring, and the next second the sound of the metal padlock fell on the floor and woke me up. I ran to see who it was, but there was no one there. Only the broken lock and chain were lying on the ground. Someone had saved me, but who? And that's when I noticed something glowing on the ground. It was some kind of cufflink, and it had an M carved into it. It must have belonged to whoever had saved me. I was still so depressed about missing the show that I didn't even give it much thought. I picked it up and ran to the stage where the show had taken place. By this point, it was after midnight, and everyone was packing up and cleaning. One of my teammates from the investment club saw me and gave me an angry look. I ran over to explain to him that I'd got locked in my room, but I didn't tell him Naomi had done it because I didn't want to screw things up with Plutus Heights. Then my teammate told me it had all worked out okay in the end because Naomi had stepped in and taken my place as host, and that she'd done an amazing job. Of course, this was her plan all along. She'd seriously taken her jealousy too far this time. The next morning, I drove home early and immediately went to Naomi's room. I was so angry and wanted to give her a piece of my mind. But I suddenly stopped in my tracks when I found her staring at her phone, crying her eyes out. Turns out, the night before, Jeremy had been caught with a model from Naomi's team, and he still hadn't come home or been in touch with her. Even though she'd ruined everything for me, I still felt sorry for her. I couldn't help it. She looked so sad. It seems like I'm not your only rival, huh? I sat down next to her. She glared at me with teary eyes and said, I'm not sorry for what I did. You deserve it. I tried to stay calm. If you listened to my explanation and was conscious enough to confront your man about what happened, instead of just believing anything they said, you'd realize the situation wasn't that bad. There was nothing between me and Jeremy, and maybe this case is the same. She looked up at me and wiped her tears, and then she started apologizing for everything. She even gave me my phone back and said she'd been so immature. I just laughed and took my phone and said, let's put all of this behind us. It was just a big misunderstanding. Friends? She looked surprised, but smiled and said, friends. After that, Naomi and I became closer. It seemed like she was really lonely. She avoided talking about Jeremy at first, but I knew she couldn't stop thinking of him. It'd been a week since the scandal with Jeremy and the model. They'd been avoiding each other. One day, she told me that she decided to host a home party as an excuse to create some time and space to have a frank talk with him. Such a girl. She always has her clever way out of trouble. So she messaged us all in our Plutus Heights WhatsApp chat to arrange a party. None of the boys seemed very excited about it. However, our house has a rule that no matter what, we can't miss a home party that is hosted by one of us. So they all had to join. Will was in Arkansas at his family's private ranch to do his annual hunting, so he invited us all there instead. I couldn't believe Will was a hunter. He didn't seem like the type at all. So, well, I guess you can't judge people on how they look. Anyway, Jeremy said that we could get a lift on his private jet, but Mark said he'd fly by himself as he had a business trip nearby. I wasn't so keen to try hunting. It looked seriously dangerous, and I had no idea how to use a gun, so all of us newbies just watched from the observatory tower and looked through the binoculars to see what Will was up to. It was actually pretty cool. Will was riding a horse and was chasing a wild deer. I'd never seen anything like it. When I said, "Wow, guys, how cool is Will?" no one replied to me. Seemed I was the only one interested in it. Aaliyah and David were busy taking photos, and Naomi and Jeremy were nowhere to be seen. They must have gone off somewhere private to chat. Well, I think it was time for them to end the silence in their relationship. After a while, I went back to Will's parents' mansion and found a quiet corner to sit and have a cup of tea and watch the sunset. It felt so nice to have a moment to myself, and I was so busy staring out the window admiring the stunning sky that I didn't even notice someone had come and sat next to me. It was Will, and he turned to me and said,
Lou, you're not cut out for the lavish city life, are you? I think you're much more suited to this simple farm girl life. You look happier here than you do back at Plutus Heights. I was shocked. He said this in a cold kind of tone, so I couldn't figure out if he was complimenting me or criticizing me. Did he think I was some simpleton? Not cool enough for the big city life? I asked him, "What do you mean? Are you mocking me?" But we were interrupted by a buzzing welcome sound outside. Will ignored what I'd asked and just said, "Mark's here." Then he got up and went outside to join everyone. We were having a barbecue that night, and the staff at Will's mansion had just finished preparing everything. Jeremy and Naomi looked all cozy, so they'd clearly made up. I went over to join them, and that's when I heard everyone asking what had happened to Mark. He had this big wound on his hand, but he just said that he'd been careless and hurt himself after the fashion show after breaking something. Breaking something? After the fashion show? Oh my God, it all made sense now. It was Mark who had saved me. He'd broken the lock and accidentally hurt his hand. And the cufflink with the M for Mark. I couldn't believe it. But why had he saved me and left without saying a word? Hi, it's me again, Lou. In the last episode, Naomi went crazy at me when she thought Jeremy had cheated on her with me. Then she took it too far and tried to destroy my reputation by locking me in my room so I wouldn't be able to take on the host role of the fashion show. Luckily, a mysterious stranger rescued me. All I knew was that he wore cufflinks with the letter M on them. After that, just when I wanted to give Naomi a piece of my mind, I saw her crying as she found out Jeremy was with another girl. I comforted her and we made up. Then we all went to Arkansas to Will's family's hunting ranch,
And that was when I realized who had rescued me that night. Mark! I couldn't stop glancing at Mark's hand as we all ate. It all made so much sense. After the barbecue, Mark said he wanted to go to the observatory to get some fresh air. This was my chance. I waited a bit, and then I headed over there so I could thank him. When I got there, Mark glanced at me, but then he turned back and kept looking at the view. I took the cufflink out of my pocket and showed it to him. Then I smiled as I said, "So you're my knight in shining armor then? The one who saved me from Naomi's horrible prank?" Mark looked at the cufflink and then said to me,
"What are you talking about? Listen, I don't have the time or energy to get involved in Naomi's stupid pranks."
Although I was quite surprised by Mark's denial, I figured he was just shy. Then I said, "It's okay. Don't be shy. I just want to thank you." But before I could even finish my sentence, he'd walked away. All right, I know this guy's stubbornness. If he didn't want to admit it, I would not bring it up again. So I just smiled and put the cufflink back in my pocket and headed downstairs. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Mark. Why had he rescued me? I thought he was the worst when I'd first met him, but that night in Vegas, we'd had so much fun. But then he'd left me all alone. But then he'd rescued me. It was so confusing. He'd acted cold because he had some cool guy persona to keep up, but I could feel that underneath he was the sweetest, caring guy. And this just made me want to get to know him even more. Back at Plutus Heights, I felt closer to everyone after the trip. Aaliyah was being particularly sweet to me, and one day she came to my room while I was working on a project. She looked sad and let out a big sigh as she said, "Lou, you gotta help me. I really need some advice." "What happened?" I asked her. Then she said, "My parents want me to marry the CEO of their partner company. They said it'll give our family more power and make us look good." She was almost crying as she told me this. I couldn't believe that in this day and age, there were still people arranging marriages like this, all for status and power. That's not how love works. What happened to freedom of choice? She was sobbing now as she told me the rest of the story. "This man has been chasing me for a while now. He often visits my parents' house, and I thought it was to see my dad. But now I realize it was because of me. It makes me sick. My parents keep saying I'll never have to worry about a thing because he's super rich. But he's 41. I don't want to marry some old rich guy." "What? He was like double her age. Aaliyah was only 19. That was insane. What were her parents thinking?" I comforted her and asked, "Did you try telling your parents you're not interested?" She said, "I did. I tried everything. I begged them. But they insisted that I follow the family tradition, that a daughter's marriage should be chosen by the parents because they know what's best for her. Honestly, could my life get any worse?" Poor Aaliyah. I felt so sorry for her. "Is there anything I can do to help?" I asked her. She looked at me through tears and said, "Really? You'll help me?" So I said, duh. We're friends, right? That's what friends are for." So then she told me she needed to find a guy who would pretend to be her boyfriend because she'd already blurted out to her parents that she was dating someone. Then she said, "My mom and dad want me to meet him this weekend to see if he's suitable enough for me to marry." "Have you found anyone yet?" I asked her. Then she said, "Nope, but I need someone good-looking, smart, and most importantly, he must come from a rich family. Out of our friends, the only one who ticks all of those boxes is Mark. And, okay, I'm going to be honest with you now. I've had a serious crush on him ever since I moved in here. So maybe this is my chance. I know it's so awkward to ask him, but you're in his investment club, and you two talk to each other quite often. So can you go ask him for me? Please?" Okay, I didn't like this idea one bit. Aaliyah said she had a crush on Mark, huh? I weirdly felt so uncomfortable knowing this. Suddenly, I realized that I seemed to have a crush on him too. Ever since returning from the trip to Will's hunting ranch, he had always been the last person I thought about before falling asleep. But then, maybe it was just to trick her parents. And she was my friend. I had to help her, right? So I told her I'd chat to Mark. Gosh, I'm a good friend. She was so happy and said, "Oh, Lou, thank you so much. Make sure he knows it's not for real. It's just a favor. He'll be saving my life." Okay, cool. So it was all just to please her parents. It wasn't real, and I had nothing to worry about, right? Aaliyah had been such a good friend to me, so this was the least I could do to help her. The next day, on the way back from the investment club, my car stalled right in the middle of the road and wouldn't start. I had no idea what was wrong, so I had to call and get assistance. As I was on the phone, I noticed Mark's fancy convertible parked next to me.
"Get in the car,"
he said.
"I just called the towing service."
OMG, I couldn't believe it. Once again, he showed up just when I needed help. He really was my knight in shining armor. I got into his car, and there was this super awkward silence. Then I plucked up the courage to speak to him. "Mark, are you free this Saturday? I wanted to ask if you could do me a favor. Would that be okay?"
"I'm never free,"
he replied. "Oh, okay. I mean, I knew he was a very busy person, so it was stupid of me to have even asked him. But then he said,
"What do you need?"
"Oh, so he was giving me a chance." I then told him Aaliyah's story and then nervously asked him if he'd pretend to be her boyfriend to impress her parents. I did not expect Mark to respond in the way that he did. He just laughed and said,
"How childish. Can't you think of a more convincing way? Aaliyah should just prove to her parents that she was mature enough to make her own marriage decisions."
Aaliyah tried, but it was hopeless. I put on my most persuasive face and stared at him with my puppy dog eyes all sad. This face always won my parents over, and I really hoped it would touch his heart too. He took one look at me and looked like he was about to laugh, but then he said,
"Fine, but just this one time, okay? I don't want to get caught up in all this immature love drama."
Yes! It had worked! Without even thinking, I reached over and gave him the biggest hug. I couldn't stop smiling. In a second, I secretly wished it was me who got to take him to dinner with my parents instead of Aaliyah. Then, something crazy happened. Saturday rolled around, and Aaliyah invited me to the dinner too. She thought it would make things less awkward because her parents already knew me, and I may help the conversation flow. Well, things didn't exactly go to plan. After only 10 minutes of sitting together, Aaliyah's parents outright said that Mark didn't deserve Aaliyah, that his family wasn't prestigious enough, and that they'd only gotten rich from investing in some land, and that it was just luck, not hard work or talent that had got them to where they were today. I looked over at Mark. His face was bright red, and I knew how much this was hurting him. For a guy with high self-esteem like Mark, this was just too much to bear. He immediately stood up and politely excused himself, then walked out of the restaurant. Aaliyah got up to chase after him, but her mom grabbed her arm and stopped her, so I went instead. When I got outside, I tried to pull Mark's hand back, but he pushed me away and shouted,
"Are you satisfied? They just insulted my whole family. And what's wrong with being lucky? Just because they were lucky doesn't mean they didn't work their butts off to get there. My parents are the hardest working people that I know. No one insults my family like that. No one. Do you hear me? Now leave me alone. You and Aaliyah, stay away from me."
"Mark, listen to me. Her parents didn't mean it like that. They're just blinded by their family tradition. They can't see past it. You're an amazing guy. Not many 19-year-olds work as hard as you do. You're so talented, and I admire you for this. Honestly, you're so inspiring." Mark just stared at me. Maybe, other than me, nobody had ever said that to him. Then, after a silent moment, he opened his car door and offered to drive me home. He was silent the whole way home, but after that evening, he acted differently around me. He'd always been kinda grumpy, but it was like he'd softened now and became more friendly to me. Every time I saw him, he smiled at me, and it made me so happy. He was also much more open to me. Our conversation not only revolved around the investment club, but we also shared our hobbies, family, dreams, and the things we wanted to achieve after graduation. The more we talked, the more I realized how talented and determined he was. His strictness in the club was actually how he trained himself and others to achieve their goals. That really made me admire him. And I'm not gonna lie, that admiration in me was slowly turning into a special feeling. Well, I think it could be love. As for Aaliyah, after that incident, she apologized to me and Mark for getting us involved and said her parents were so traditional. Other than that, she never mentioned this crush she had on Mark again, and I felt relieved. At least I could comfortably hang out with Mark and dream of a further future between us without having to worry that it would upset Aaliyah. And then one day, Mark asked me if I wanted to go to the grocery store with him to pick up some snacks for our Plutus Heights movie night. I happily agreed, and in the store, Mark suddenly turned to me and said,
Can you hold this, please?
I turned around to take whatever he was holding and said, Sure, what is it? Then he grinned and said,
My hand.
In the middle of the store, he grabbed my hand and didn't let go. OMG! I couldn't believe it! This was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for me. I couldn't believe how much he'd changed. He was so cute. I blushed and held his hand tighter. In that moment, I'd never been happier, and I wanted Mark to be by my side forever. Stay tuned for Season 2, where the drama of Plutus Heights continues. Will things develop between Mark and I? Only time will tell. Hi again, it's me, Lou. In Season 1, I told you guys about how I moved into a luxury mansion called Plutus Heights. I lived there with 6 other rich kids, Jeremy, Mark, Will, David, Aaliyah, Naomi, and got involved in all kinds of drama. First, there was David using me as his fake girlfriend. But later, he actually asked me to go out with him for real. Then there were rumors that Jeremy was having an affair with me, and so his girlfriend Naomi made my life hell. But luckily, a handsome mystery man came to the rescue, who turned out to be Mark. Now Mark and I are dating, and I've never been happier. Well, so are you ready for Season 2? Honestly, things between Mark and I have been great, and so have things at Plutus Heights. It's as if all the drama fizzled out, and the 7 of us were getting along so well. We even decided to take a big group trip together to celebrate the end of the semester. And because we were all nearing the end of our time at college, which meant we wouldn't be living together much longer, we were having a Mediterranean cruise trip, traveling through Spain, Portugal, France. But when we were on the way to our next destination, Venice, Italy, the pandemic suddenly broke out of nowhere. So obviously, we had to change the itineraries and shorten our trip, which was a bummer, but luckily, we were solely traveling on our private cruise and staying in private resorts. So we weren't in danger. That's the most important thing. Though, along with the chaos going on out there with planet Earth, stuff on the cruise wasn't exactly peaceful either. A new chapter of drama has begun. One night, we were out drinking on the deck, enjoying some fancy French wine that we'd picked up along the way. It was the perfect night. The weather was warm and balmy, the stars were out, and there was this cool sea breeze all around us. I'd never experienced anything like it before. Even though my parents are rich, they didn't really flash their cash around, so I'd never really learned how to fully make the most of life like my friends had. And I thought, it's not too bad leading a modest life. Everyone even joked with me, saying that I was too uptight, and that my family was rich, but it was such a shame that I didn't know how to spend money. They were probably right. I really should let loose a bit and enjoy life a little more, as trips like this have been really fun. That night, we were drinking and chatting when suddenly, Jeremy got up and said he had to have an emergency call with his tour manager after COVID had caused his tour to get canceled. That was so unfortunate. Everyone kinda quieted down after he left. Then Mark leaned over to me and said,
Let's go back to our room too, babe.
And that's when Aaliyah looked over at us and whined, Ew, get a room! I can't stand watching you two lovebirds. Then she got up and left. It was kinda awkward, but David quickly interrupted and said,
What is wrong with you guys? You're such party poopers. Stop killing my vibe. Listen up. No one is leaving until we finish this bottle.
and at that, he popped open another bottle of champers, and we all cheered. We ended up staying up super late, reminiscing about the trip so far, and looking at all our photos. It was so much fun, and we all had a good laugh. At one point, Naomi popped up from her seat. Oh, Lou, remember that pic I took of you at Parkwell? That one was so funny. It's on Jeremy's camera, though. Let me go get it. Oh, and where's Aaliyah? Let me go get her, too. Then she ran off in excitement. We were all tipsy by this point, and in a good mood. We started talking about where we'd go next on our trip, and I suggested we should make this an annual thing because it had been so much fun. But just as I said that, I heard someone yelling. It was Naomi, and she didn't sound excited anymore. She was super angry. I can't believe it! In our bedroom? Jeremy, are you for real? You're cheating on me in our own room? What is wrong with you? Oh my God, Jeremy was a serial cheater. Poor Naomi. And then I started to panic. Who had he been cheating with? Please tell me it wasn't Aaliyah. We all ran to the room, and I prayed so hard that it wouldn't be her, because then our friendships would all be over. The whole way to the room, we could hear Jeremy and Naomi shouting at each other. I am speechless, Jer. What do you have to say for yourself, Naomi screamed. Then Jeremy said,
I thought it was you, babe. I'm a bit drunk. And she came into the room, and it was dark, and...
Then Naomi interrupted, saying, What? You thought it was me? You're drunk, but you're not blind. Look, we look nothing alike. You've sunk too low this time, Jer. We caught up with them, and when we looked into their room, Jeremy was on the floor begging Naomi for forgiveness, and there was another girl on the bed. The maid! Oh my God, he cheated on Naomi with the maid. But at least, thank goodness, it wasn't Aaliyah. It could have been so much worse. Eventually, Aaliyah showed up to help me calm Naomi down, and that night, the three of us slept in Aaliyah's room. We couldn't leave Naomi alone because she was so upset. I couldn't believe how everything had just changed in the blink of an eye. One moment, we were having the best vacation of our lives, and the next, it was all a mess. Naomi only fell asleep around 3 a.m., and I only know that was the time because my dad suddenly called me. I would have thought it was strange, but it was still evening back in New York. Maybe he was missing me. I was actually relieved to speak to him, and I excitedly said, Hi, Dad. What's up? But as soon as I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. He didn't sound happy at all.
Pumpkin, there's this thing, you see. Our company, well, it's having some trouble. This pandemic is so harsh. Could you come home soon? I really need your help.
After that call, I couldn't sleep a wink. I was so worried about my family. The next morning, I told everyone what had happened, and they were so understanding. Will even offered to lend me his private jet so I could get home ASAP. Mark decided to come with me, so we packed up and got ready to leave. I felt so bad leaving Naomi after what had happened, but now I had my own heartbreaking news to deal with too. When we got home, my mom and dad sat us down, and it took a few minutes to tell me what was going on. The truth was, my dad had just filed for bankruptcy. It felt like my whole world had just come crumbling down around me as I heard my dad tell me. My whole body was shaking, and all I could say was, No! What? Then my dad explained.
I'm afraid we just couldn't survive this pandemic. Our branches in Asia have been frozen for months, and now in Europe too. The domestic ones don't seem to be able to hold up for long either. It's been so hard, and there's nothing we can do now. But don't worry, Pumpkin. Just finish your studies. That's the important thing. We can still afford your last semester. Go get that degree, then come help me revive our company, okay?
By the time he'd finished speaking, he was choked up, and we both started crying as he reached out to give me a big hug. I had to be strong and push through my last semester and graduate, no matter what. But it wasn't going to be easy. The news was already out. It was all over the internet, and even in the newspapers. Everyone knew my family had gone bankrupt, and I felt like all eyes were on me everywhere I went. It was so stressful, and I knew people were whispering about me. I was nervous to go back to the investment club, aka the rich kid club, because I knew they'd look down on me and my family now. And they did. Now, they made me do tasks that only newbies had to do, like collecting data and stuff. One time, we had a team meeting, and Mark needed someone to be team leader for the upcoming project.
Who do you guys think will be suitable for this task?
Mark said. To be honest, I didn't care. My head was elsewhere, worrying about my family's situation, but I quickly snapped back as I heard a girl mentioning my name. Anyone but Louise, because obviously, her family's company is dead. We don't want her to push us into bankruptcy too. Everyone laughed, and I was so humiliated. I almost burst into tears in front of them all and had to clench my fists and bite my cheek to stop myself from embarrassing myself even more. Suddenly, Mark slammed his fists down on the table and told them off. I was so grateful to him, but at the same time, embarrassed. I felt so vulnerable all of a sudden. But at least I had Mark. He was the only good thing in my life at that point. Even though he was my shoulder to lean on and we told each other most things, there was one thing I'd been hiding from him. Ever since we got back from the cruise, I'd been receiving hate mail. At first, I thought it was just some kind of prank, but now it felt serious. I was too scared to bring it up, as I didn't want to make the tension at Plutus Heights even worse. Things between Jeremy and Naomi were awful, and Naomi was moving out. So the last thing everyone needed was to hear about my hate mail. It started with a letter that said, "What are you still doing here? You don't belong with the rich kids anymore." Who would say this to me? I didn't want to suspect any of my friends. I mean, why would they say that stuff to me? Plus, the message was made up from cut-off letters in magazines, so I couldn't even base on handwriting or anything to tell who it could be. That continued for 2 or 3 more times. Still, I tried to ignore it. But one night, after an exhausting day at school, I threw myself onto my bed and picked up my favorite book. But as I opened it, a letter fell onto me. More hate mail! This one said, "So you're still here? Becoming a gold digger now, are you? We all know you can't afford to live here, and no one likes you anyway. So get your poor ass out of here. You're ruining our reputation." That was the cherry on top. I already felt stressed at college from all the gossip, and now I didn't even feel safe in my own home. This wasn't a home anymore. I immediately got up and packed my suitcase, crying as I did it. It was simple. I'd just leave. I hoped they'd all be happy now. It was already late, so everyone was in their rooms. I couldn't face seeing them, so I dragged my suitcase as quietly as possible downstairs to leave the house. I didn't even think about where I was going. I just figured I'd get out, find a cab, and go stay in some motel near the campus. As I was walking, I heard a car honking from across the road.
Lou! Hey, Lou! Is that you? What are you doing outside this late?
I turned around and saw it was David, and as soon as he saw me with tears streaming down my face, he leapt out of the car and came running over to me.
Hey, what happened?
He asked me. "I'm leaving," I told him through tears. "That's what everyone wants, right? I'm sorry I bothered you all for so long." He looked confused and said,
What? Who wants that? I don't. Come on, don't be ridiculous. Come back to the house. Let's sort this out.
I refused and told him to leave me alone, but he'd already grabbed my suitcase and then he grabbed my hand and made me get in the car. I was really crying by this point as I told him about the hate mail, and he was so mad. As soon as we got home, he shouted at the top of his voice,
"Emergency meeting now! Everyone wake up!"
Then he ran around the house knocking on everyone's doors, even though I tried to stop him. Hi, it's Lou back again. If you remember, in the last episode, I told you that we decided to take a big group trip together to celebrate the end of the semester. Well, everything was going great at first, but then when we were on our cruise, things started to go downhill. Naomi caught Jeremy cheating on her. I found out my parents had filed for bankruptcy, and then to top it all off, I started receiving nasty hate mail forcing me to leave the mansion immediately. So one night, I decided to leave Plutus Heights. I clearly wasn't welcome there, but David spotted me leaving and made me come back home with him so that we could sort it all out. Everybody was so confused about why David had called an emergency meeting. No one had a clue what was going on. Mark saw me crying, so he rushed over to comfort me, and that's when David told everyone that I'd been receiving threats and hate mail over the past week, and that the person who'd written them had said I should leave the mansion ASAP. I looked around the room, and everyone was suddenly suspicious of each other. David spoke up and said,
"Whoever wrote these letters is a coward, and I'm gonna find out which of you did it and kick you out. This kind of bullying is not acceptable at Plutus Heights. Lou, show them the letters."
So I pulled the letters out of my bag and handed them around. Suddenly, Naomi said, "Could it be?" We all went silent and stared at her, waiting for her to finish the sentence, but she didn't say anything more.
Mark got mad and said, "Just spit it out! Say it already!"
Naomi continued, "I'm not sure, but a few days ago I went to Aaliyah's room to get my lipstick that she borrowed. I accidentally dropped it under her bed, and when I picked it up, I found a piece of paper with the letter E that looked like it had been cut out of a magazine or something. Now, looking at this letter, it looks pretty familiar. Aaliyah, it was you, wasn't it?" This made me so confused. "Naomi, do you know what you're talking about? How could it be Aaliyah?" But Naomi was adamant. "The evidence is all there, Lou." "I think this is some kind of misunderstanding," I said. "Aaliyah would never do that." Then suddenly, Aaliyah interrupted us. "Just stop it. Yes, it was me. I wrote those letters, okay? You act like you're some angel, but I've seen the real you. You're a snake. You knew I liked Mark, and I asked you to help us become a couple. But what do? You go behind my back and betray me and steal him from me. You're a traitor. You don't deserve to live here, and you definitely don't deserve to have friends like us." Oh my God, I couldn't hold back my tears. I burst out crying, and Naomi rushed over to hug me. Mark said,
"Stop this! Aaliyah, you're insane. I don't like you, and I never will. What were you thinking?"
I kept crying as I said, "This is why I wanted to leave the mansion. I don't belong here." "Yeah, get the heck out of here. I can't stand living under the same roof as you. Thank God you finally get it." Aaliyah looked at me and spoke in a sarcastic tone. David suddenly stepped in and said,
"The only person who needs to leave is you, Aaliyah. I can't believe how cruel you are. I vote that Aaliyah leaves the house right now. Who's with me?"
Everybody raised their hands, except me. I was just standing there looking at the ground, wishing it would swallow me up. Then Mark said,
"Okay, it's been decided. Aaliyah will leave Plutus Heights. Lou's staying."
At that, Aaliyah lost it. "You traitors! You'll regret this!" she screamed. Then she left and went to her room, slamming the door behind her. We could hear her noisily packing up her room. Then she called her butler to pick her up. I couldn't believe it. How could she treat me like this? I thought we were close friends. A few days later, Naomi also moved out. She couldn't stand being around Jeremy anymore. This made me want to leave too, because the house just felt filled with sad memories now. And also, I couldn't exactly afford it anymore. I called Naomi to tell her this, and she asked me if I wanted to move in with her. Without even thinking about it, I said yes. And I'm so glad I did, because Naomi and I had so much fun living together. We comforted each other and helped each other get over the drama with Jeremy and Aaliyah. We started to do everything together. Shopping, eating out, and I even went with Naomi to some of her modeling shoots. Sometimes we even had movie nights where we'd curl up on the sofa together. Occasionally, I'd notice Naomi not paying attention to the movie, but just staring at me. And one time I joked, "I know, I'm beautiful, right?" She just laughed and turned away. Then one night, we went to our favorite bar for cocktails. We were having such a fun night, but I think we drank a bit too much. because Naomi told me something that shook me to my core. Lou, I need to tell you something. I've wanted to tell you for so long. I'm in love with you. I laughed. I love you too, Naomi. But then Naomi hiccuped and said, No, Lou, I love you. Like, I'm in love with you. Why else would I ask you to come live with me? Oh my God. What? I slowly backed away from Naomi and didn't know where to look. This was so horribly awkward. Firstly, I wasn't a lesbian. Secondly, I was dating Mark. And thirdly, was Naomi crazy? Naomi, you've got this all wrong. I thought we were just best friends. I'm not interested in you in that way. Sorry. I waited for her to reply, and she just smiled and said, No, I get it. It's okay. Forget about it. I'm just drunk. It's fine. We can still be friends, right? After that, we went home, and it was so awkward. All I wanted to do was go to bed and wake up and forget it ever happened. Lucky me, after that night, Naomi never mentioned it again. Maybe she knew I was feeling awkward, so she tried to be as cheerful and natural as possible. Even though our conversations were still a bit awkward, but that's okay. I really hoped that it was just a temporary feeling, and Naomi would quickly forget it so that we could remain close friends as we were now. And about Mark, ever since I'd moved in with Naomi, I hadn't seen him as much. Recently, we'd sometimes gone 3 or 4 days without even speaking, and when I called him, he'd often say he was busy and he'd call me back, but he never did. It seemed like there was something wrong, and it made me worried. Then, something terrible happened to our relationship on the day we were supposed to celebrate our 6-month anniversary. On that day, he took me to a fancy French restaurant, and out of surprise, we bumped into Mark's parents, who had just finished eating and were on their way out. Mark looked surprised to see them and said,
Mom, Dad, what are you doing here?
His dad spoke up and said,
We just had dinner with some business partners. And who's this lovely lady? Aren't you going to introduce us?
Mark said,
Oh, right, sorry. This is Lou. Her family owns a chain of famous restaurants. Your favorite one, remember?
Then his dad looked shocked and said,
Hang on. Is she the daughter of the family who just went bankrupt?
It was so awkward. Mark suddenly went bright red, and then his dad said,
You don't really have a brain, do you? What are you doing hanging out with her? She's a nobody. She's got nothing left. A family like hers would just be a burden. Don't you care about your future?
Then, to my astonishment, he looked at Mark with an absolute determination.
Do you know how hard your mom and I worked so that you have a secured future? Break up with her immediately. Don't let me see you with her again.
I didn't know how to react and just waited for Mark to stand up to his dad, but all he said was,
Okay, Dad, I understand.
I couldn't believe it. Then his dad said,
Great. Your mother will set you up on a blind date with a girl that is more worthy of you. Won't you, dear?
Then they left and didn't even look at me. I was shaking with rage as I turned to Mark. Never in my life had anyone spoken about me like that before, right in front of me. And the worst part was that Mark hadn't even stood up for me. Not once. What just happened? Why didn't you stand up for me? How could you let him talk to me like that? He's such a... Mark didn't let me finish my sentence and interrupted me angrily, saying,
Don't you dare. That's my dad. And anyway, what he said wasn't entirely wrong.
I was fuming by this point. Oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. Don't I mean anything to you? You didn't even say no when he mentioned the blind date. Mark told me to calm down and said,
Chill, Lou. It's just a blind date. I'll meet her to keep my parents happy, but obviously I'll reject her. You don't need to worry.
I was shocked. Unbelievable! So, you just do everything to please your parents, don't you? Don't you have your own opinion? You're like a little sheep to them. Mark suddenly exploded and said, How dare you? I could see he was seriously angry because he gave me a look that I'd never seen before. I couldn't bear it, so I just rushed out of the restaurant in tears. He didn't even bother to chase after me. When I got home, I went straight to my room and buried myself under the covers. I'd never been so disappointed in my life. The way Mark just stood there as his dad badmouthed me and my family? How could he let him do this to me? That weekend, I wanted to try to forget about my sadness. I was sick of lying in bed feeling sorry for myself. So I asked Naomi, Will, and David if they wanted to go on a trip with me. David said we could go stay at his private resort. And so that's what we did. We played golf, got spa treatments, and went to the beach. It cheered me up a bit, but every time I thought about Mark, I got sad again. One evening, Will and I were lying on the beach watching the sunset. Naomi and David were down by the water, and she was doing some high-fashion poses while David took pics of her. Will turned to me and said,
"How are you feeling now? Better, I hope."
I wasn't expecting him to ask me that, so I just said, "What?" "Oh, yes. I'm feeling better, thanks. Much more relaxed." Then Will asked if he could share something with me, and I told him sure. I couldn't believe what he said.
"Lou, I think you should chat to Mark and ask him if he sees a future for the two of you. If he says no, then maybe you should move on."
Hearing Will say that, another guy, it really made me question my relationship with Mark. I just assumed we'd be together forever, which was probably so dumb of me. What if Mark really didn't see a future for us? It was too much to even think about. I didn't want to lose him even though he'd hurt me so much by not standing up for me. I didn't know what to say. So I asked Will what he would do if he was in Mark's shoes. He looked at me and took a deep breath. Then he said,
"Honestly, Lou, if you were my girlfriend, I would have stood up for you no matter what. I'd never let anyone hurt you. Never."
Then he looked me right in the eyes and didn't stop staring at me. I'd never seen him look at me like this before. What did it mean? Hi, it's me, Lou. I'm back again to tell you the next part of my story. Firstly, here's a quick refresher. So, in the last episode, I discovered that Aaliyah was responsible for all the hate mails. So she got asked to leave Plutus Heights. Then Naomi moved out too. So I moved in with her, and that's when she told me she was in love with me. Fortunately, after I politely rejected her, we could still be friends. As for things with Mark, we bumped into his parents in a French restaurant right on our 6-month anniversary, and his dad told him to break up with me. I hoped that he would protect me from his dad's insults, but no! Can you believe Mark didn't even stand up for me? I was so angry, and we started quarreling. Then I went on a trip with Naomi, David, and Will, where Will told me that if I was his girlfriend, he'd never let anyone hurt me. So that's a quick recap of the last episode. Now, are you ready for the next part of my story? When we got back from that trip, I felt much better because it reminded me how amazing and supportive my friends are. I kept thinking about what Will had said, that I had to go speak to Mark and see if he thought we had a future together. Maybe he was right. However, Mark and I hadn't even talked since then. In fact, he hadn't even tried to contact me. This silence made me exhausted. Although I couldn't forget what Mark's dad had said about me, I still loved Mark so much. And honestly, I missed him like crazy. I couldn't wait any longer, so eventually, I decided to just call him. When he answered, he sounded like he didn't even have time to speak to me, and his voice had such a cold tone. I found myself apologizing to him for what I'd said because it was not okay. Then I said I wanted to continue with our relationship and that we didn't need to worry about the future yet because we were still so young. Mark agreed, but he didn't say much, just that he was busy and would call me back later. Afterwards, I felt relieved. The Cold War between us had made me sad and miserable, but everything was going to be okay. And yet, I couldn't get his cold tone out of my head. Why was he acting so indifferent? Did he not love me anymore? A few weeks later, things weren't much better. I could count on one hand the amount of times Mark and I had seen each other because he was so busy with the company and the investment club. As for me, I had to study a lot before graduating so that I could help my parents. It was really frustrating. If I didn't call Mark, he wouldn't call me at all. I often looked at the cufflink that I'd found when he saved me and found myself getting lost in thoughts of the past. He used to call me all the time, no matter how busy he was. I missed that. Suddenly, I was so worried. It felt like our love was fading, and nothing could prevent it. If that really happened, how would I cope? One day, I called my dad to see if he was okay, and he sounded exhausted. Then he told me something that shocked me even more than the bankruptcy. Him and my mom were getting a divorce. I couldn't believe it. I asked him how this had happened, but he just sighed and told me that he wanted rest and would call me back later. And then he hung up. Eventually, I called my aunt, who was my dad's sister, to find out the truth. She said that my mom had been having an affair with a rich man who'd been my dad's partner for a long time because she couldn't stand this poverty anymore. Oh my God, this was too much. There I was, wrapped up in my petty love drama, when in fact, my dad needed me. This had to be the most difficult moment of his life, and there was no way I could leave him all alone. I got to my parents' house, and I was shaking as I opened the door. I wanted to wake up from this nightmare to have my mom back. When I saw my dad sitting on the couch, he looked surprised to see me. He just smiled and asked me to come sit down. It looked like he'd lost some weight. And he told me my mom had moved out a few days ago. I couldn't hold back my tears. Our lives were falling apart. My mom hadn't even told me any of this. She just made the decision by herself and left. How could she do this to us? How could she be so selfish? Back at Plutus Heights, everyone knew my parents were getting divorced. Naomi and David had texted me to comfort me, but Mark hadn't even texted me once. He must have known because David was his cousin and told him everything. So what was wrong with him? He was my boyfriend and he didn't even care. All he had to do was call me or even just text and say he hoped I was okay. But nope, nothing. Suddenly, I realized how stupid I'd been. I'd been chasing him this whole time, and now when I needed him the most, he was nowhere to be seen. That evening, I decided to make dinner for my dad, and it made me think about the good old days when Mom was still here. My dad loved to cook, and my mom would always be his assistant, helping him chop veg and clean up the kitchen. I missed my mom so much. Why did life have to be like this? Love was so fragile. Could Mark and I get through this? As I was wondering about this, the doorbell rang. I ran to open it, and to my complete surprise, Will was standing there with a bottle of wine and a basket of fruit. I literally gasped in surprise. What was he doing here? He just smiled and said he'd had a meeting nearby and wanted to pop by to say hello. My dad was excited because ever since the bankruptcy, no one had been around to visit him. My dad went into the kitchen and started cooking, and Will and I helped him. Will chatted to my dad in such a friendly way, and they were getting along so well. Every so often, Will would look over at me and smile. It made me blush, and I didn't understand why. The three of us sat down to enjoy the meal, and it made me happy to see my dad so excited. He couldn't stop chatting to Will, and even asked him if he had a girlfriend at one point. He just laughed and said,
"I'm just waiting for the right girl."
Then he looked at me. Suddenly, I felt a bit flustered and reached out for the bottle of wine. But Will reached out at exactly the same moment, and our hands touched. I blushed and felt so embarrassed. What was wrong with me? Was it because I was drunk? Will must have sensed I was embarrassed, because he changed the subject and started saying how he was a big fan of the dishes in my family's restaurant and that he missed it so much. So my dad said he could come over whenever he was free, and my dad would cook them for him. Then they continued to chat about food and business, and Will said that even though he couldn't afford to help my dad rebuild the business, he wanted to invest a little bit to help him open a small restaurant and start again. At first, My dad was so shocked and moved by Will's suggestion, but then he agreed and kept thanking him, saying that cooking made his life more meaningful. I couldn't believe it. Will was being so kind, and I didn't know how to repay him. I told him I'd pay him back after graduation. Then after dinner, he stayed and chatted to my dad for hours. I could see it really cheered my dad up. I was so grateful to Will and couldn't stop thinking about that evening. He'd made me feel so secure, and he was just so considerate. Soon, we were about to graduate. We decided to organize a ceremony along with a big photo shoot together to celebrate, and it was going to take place at a resort which was owned by one of our classmates' family. However, just before, there was a rumor going around that Aaliyah's sensitive photos had been exposed, and her rich fiancé had decided to cancel their wedding even though it was going to be in a few weeks. This was such bad news for Aaliyah. I wondered if she would come to the ceremony. Well, anyway, the ceremony day arrived, and tons of photographers had been hired. There was so much wine and food, and there was even a red carpet. It was so fancy, and we all took photos together. This was our last party as students, and we wanted to make it one to remember. Mark hadn't arrived yet, as he said he'd had a meeting to go to first, so would be a bit late. I was hanging out with Naomi and Will. As for Jeremy, he had a drink and chatted with others on the other side to avoid Naomi. Then, after a while, Aaliyah arrived too. She looked really annoyed, and Naomi whispered to me to be careful around her, in case she caused any trouble. Well, not 1 minute later, Aaliyah was marching towards me. She was smirking and said, "So your family went bankrupt, and yet you can still afford to attend this fancy ceremony? Lou, honestly, you don't belong here. Run back home to your poor family." Finding that what she was saying was nonsense, I just walked away from her without saying anything. Honestly, I had nothing to say to that rude girl. But then I heard Naomi and Aaliyah arguing. Naomi was saying that Aaliyah had no right to judge me, and then I heard Aaliyah shouting back. That's when I realized I had to do something. I stepped in between them and asked them to stop, but Aaliyah wouldn't give up. Suddenly, she pushed me into the pool. The next moment, I was under the water, and I was shocked. I couldn't get to the surface. I was choking and struggling and felt myself sinking. Right when I was panicking the most, I could just make someone out, jumping into the pool and grabbing me. I thought to myself, "Mark, is that you? Saving me again?" Then I passed out. As I opened my eyes, I saw a boy standing over me, soaking wet. He was calling my name, and he looked so worried. I was still so scared and was clutching onto his wrist. Then I saw something familiar. The cufflink. Is that Mark? I thought. But when I started to see more clearly, I realized it wasn't Mark. It was Will. He was so relieved to see me awake and alert and gave me the biggest hug. Then he asked Naomi to help me up while he ran to get my coat. Aaliyah still had the audacity to stand there and laugh at me. "Look, everyone, it's Lou, the drowned rat. She's so poor, she has to rely on rich guys to look after her. Pathetic." Naomi was so angry, I thought she was going to hit Aaliyah. She told Aaliyah to shut up and leave me alone. People were pointing at us and saying something. I turned around, and that's when I saw Mark. He was standing in the crowd, looking at me. When he saw I'd seen him, he just turned around and walked away. I have never felt so small in my life. Clearly, our relationship was over. To make it worse, Aaliyah saw Mark leaving and said, "Like father, like daughter. Your mom left your dad, and Mark has left you. Serves you right. Who would want to be with a poor girl?" My heart was completely broken. Was Aaliyah right? Had Mark left me because I was poor now? What did it matter anyway? It was over. But there was something else on my mind. The cufflink. Had I mistaken Mark for Will? Was it Will that had saved me that day? In the background, I could still hear Aaliyah mocking me, but I just blocked it out. Naomi was hugging me, telling me everything was going to be okay, and then Will appeared and put my coat over my shoulders and said,
"You don't need to worry about a thing."
Then he took my hand and we left that mess behind us. Hi, it's me, Lou. I'm back again to tell you the final part of my story. But first of all, do you remember what happened in the previous part? Well, in the last episode, things between Mark and I were really awkward. He knew that my parents got a divorce, but hadn't even texted me once. In that very difficult time, the only person who was really there for me was Will. He comforted my dad and offered to help him start a new business. This made me look at Will in a whole new light. Then, our ceremony along with a big photo shoot arrived, and a terrible incident happened to me. Aaliyah mocked me and pushed me into the pool. Will saved me this time, and then I realized that maybe it was Will who had saved me the last time too. Will led me to the parking lot, and his hand felt so warm in mine, I started to feel butterflies in my stomach. He'd helped my dad, and now he'd helped me. He was really going above and beyond. He drove me home, and that's when I decided to ask him if he was the person who'd broken the lock that night and rescued me. He just shook his head, so I said, "But the cufflink I found, it looks exactly like yours." Then he said,
"Oh, probably just a coincidence."
I decided to leave it after that. Even though he denied it, I still had a hunch it was him. Will dropped me off and came in to make sure I was okay. He offered to stay with me until Naomi got home, but I told him I'd be okay. After he left and I heard his car drive off, I suddenly felt so empty inside. Everything was silent, and I just lay there holding the cufflink that I kept under my pillow and fell asleep. A few days later, while I was sitting at home watching movies, I received a package. Inside was a wedding invitation from Jeremy, and it was for me and Naomi. I couldn't believe he'd moved on so quickly. I was even more surprised to learn that his bride was some model from Naomi's agency. I heard Naomi said that this girl was a real show-off. When Naomi got home, I showed her the invitation, and her face fell. She immediately ripped it up and said there was no way on earth she'd attend that traitor's wedding. I told her I wouldn't go either then, but she said I had to because I was Mark's girlfriend, and Mark was Jeremy's best friend. Was I, though? What was even going on with me and Mark? Anyway, I went to the wedding, and it was crazy. There were peacocks at the entrance, and everyone said they'd spent millions of dollars on flowers. They'd even had sculptures made of them both. It was insane. And the bride changed her dress 5 times. Obviously, I sat next to Mark, and Will was opposite me. Every time I looked up, Will would look away, but I could tell he'd been looking at me. I caught myself looking at him a lot, and I didn't really understand it, but it just made me feel warm and safe being near Will. I still felt sorry for Naomi, though. Watching Jeremy and his bride share their vows made me really touched. I held Mark's hand and said, "Isn't it beautiful?" And all he said was,
"Yeah."
Mark's indifferent reply took the wind out of my sails, but when I looked over at Will, he was smiling sweetly at Jeremy and his bride. I suddenly felt a bit sad and couldn't take my eyes off of him. But then I realized Will could see me looking at him. Oops! Afterwards, Jeremy and his wife came to toast our table. They actually made quite a cute couple, but when the bride realized Naomi wasn't here, she got quite upset and started crying. She was obviously a bit of a drama queen, as she said, "Everyone should be here to celebrate me! This is my day!" I just laughed and couldn't say anything. After the wedding ended, I said goodbye to everyone and left. Suddenly, we were all grown up, and our carefree student days were over. Who knew what the future held for us? After graduation, I started working for Will's startup company. I thought it was the best way I could do to repay him for how he helped my dad. Pretty soon, we were hanging out a lot, and even though he'd always been caring, he'd never been so warm and friendly to me before. I felt so comfortable around him. One morning, I decided to take the day off work and go shopping with Naomi. We saw Patek Philippe's new watch collection, and it immediately made me think about Will. I decided to buy him one to thank him for everything. When I got home, I texted Will and asked if he wanted to come for dinner on the weekend so I could give the watch to him. I was so excited when he said yes. As for things with Mark, it was just getting worse and worse. He was busy all the time and often away on business trips, so I barely saw him, and it made me feel really sad. Not just once did I ask myself if our love story would have a future. Then one morning, I received a message from him saying,
I have something to tell you. Let's have dinner tonight. I'll pick you up at 7:30.
Apparently, he asked me out on a date, but somehow I had a bad feeling. His tone was quite cold. Had something happened? That night, I put on my favorite dress and waited for him. He picked me up on time and took me to a very fancy restaurant. At first, we just caught up and spoke about normal things. Then, as we neared the end of the dinner, he said he needed to tell me something important. That feeling of anxiety washed over me again. I was shaking and sweating and just wanted him to spit it out. He took a deep breath. Then he said,
Lou, this is really hard for me to say, but my parents have found me a fiancé. She's great, and she will support my family business. I tried to tell them I'm with you, but they won't accept it. So, I'll get married next month. I'm sorry.
I was so shocked. I couldn't even say anything. I'd been the biggest idiot. This whole time, everything was laid out right in front of me. Ever since he'd agreed to the blind date, he'd been acting so weird towards me, like the time at the pool where he just watched me struggle. How had I been so blind to this? Mark didn't care about me. He didn't love me. All he cared about was having a girl on his arm who would add to his image as a successful businessman, and of course could support his family business. I thought I'd feel worse than I did, but I actually felt relieved. I said to him, You know what? You don't deserve me. We're over. Then I got up and left. I was disappointed, but I deserved so much better. Mark ran after me and offered to take me home, but I could get myself home. I didn't need him anymore. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I just lay there thinking about Mark and Will and all our friends. I still had dinner with Will at the weekend, and I didn't want to cancel it. Even though I didn't feel good, I knew Will would find a way to cheer me up like he always did. The weekend rolled around, and Will and I met at a restaurant near my house. He was carrying a bouquet of flowers, and I was surprised, but happy. You see, I knew he'd cheer me up. After we finished eating, I gave Will the watch. He wouldn't accept it, though, and even got a bit angry, saying,
Why would you buy me such an expensive gift? You don't owe me anything, Lou. We're friends, and friends help each other out. I can't accept this.
Then, before I could say anything, he said,
And anyway, I wanted to help your dad because I'm looking to invest in the restaurant industry. So please, stop thanking me.
Then he pushed the gift box back towards me. Will, please. I bought this for you because you're my friend and I care about you, and it made me think of you. If you're my friend, you'll take it. He rolled his eyes and said,
Fine, but you really didn't have to.
After that, things were a little awkward, and Will asked me if I was okay. Yes, that moment, my heart was full of confidence. I decided it was better just to tell him. So I told him what had happened between me and Mark. He was surprised at first, but after a moment of silence, he suddenly looked at me, and he smiled, and it made me so confused. Then he said,
Do you want to know a secret?
Then he told me that he was the mysterious stranger that had broken the lock that day, and that the cufflink which I picked up was his. The M in this stood for his surname, Mitchell. Oh my God, I knew it! I mean, I hadn't even thought about his surname before, but it all made sense. Of course it was him. He said he'd kept it a secret because he'd learned that Naomi locked me in the room and he didn't want to cause any tension at Plutus Heights. Then he confessed that he'd had a secret crush on me ever since we watched the sunset together in a small corner in his mansion. But after that, he knew Mark liked me, so he'd kept his crush a secret and just protected me from afar. Until now, when he could finally tell me how he really felt. I can't say I was surprised. I mean, I always felt Will had feelings for me, and if I'm honest with myself, I had feelings for him too, but I hadn't even realized. After he confessed, he asked me if I wanted to date him. I didn't know what to say. I was so confused. We were in a romantic restaurant with a love song playing in the background. It all just felt too much. I sat there staring at him, and his eyes were so affectionate. Seeing my confusion, he just smiled and said,
"It's okay. Take your time. I'll wait for you."
Then he took me home, and before I got out of the car, he grabbed my hand and kissed it. I quickly said goodbye to him and ran into the house. Then I lay down on my bed and thought about what Will had said, that he'd wait for me. I must have fallen asleep because the next moment I was dreaming of me and Will walking along the beach at sunset. The next morning, I woke up and I knew my answer. I texted Will and asked if he could meet me in the park near my house. As soon as I saw him, I looked in his eyes and said, "Will, I've always been looking for my knight in shining armor. Now I know. It's you, and I will not miss this opportunity." He smiled brightly, hugged me tightly, and then kissed my forehead. Never had I felt so safe and warm with happiness overflowing in my heart. That's right, he was the one who saved me that day, the one who helped my family through difficult times, and also the one who has silently cared and protected me for so long. He was the guy who truly loved and cared about me. And ever since then, we've been an official couple, and I have never been happier than I am right now. I've finally found the love of my life, and life couldn't be sweeter. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Did you guess that I'd end up with Will? He was the one for me all along. It just took me some time to realize. But the best things are often the things worth waiting for. Right?